Up to this point, we've been talking about the many benefits one receives by forgiving others. I trust this has been a good experience for you and that you have made some excellent progress on your journey. Yet for many people, the real challenge is not in forgiving others, but how to forgive themselves. This is often more difficult because you not only need to offer forgiveness, but you also need to accept it as well. This can be difficult, for you know exactly what you did wrong. And as a result, you may feel so bad about what you did that you just don't feel you deserve forgiveness. Therefore, you withhold forgiveness from yourself, the very forgiveness you need, because you simply don't believe you deserve it. Does that sound anything at all like you? I'll never forget an experience where I served as the host of an honor banquet. At the end of the program, my job was to thank those who made the program possible. I did not have notes, so I had to do this by memory. I thanked everyone I could think of, and then I walked off the stage. As I did, one of the planners told me I forgot to mention someone who had spent countless hours working on the program behind the scenes. This person had no other opportunity to be recognized. I was devastated. I immediately went to that person and told her how sorry I was. She seemed to take it well. However, I did not. The next day, I had flowers sent to her office with another note of apology. I would tell everyone I could how bad I felt. While some of this sorrow was legitimate, it seemed to go too far with me. Eventually, as time went by, I seemed to have forgotten the event. That is, until the next year when I was asked to host the program again. I refused to do so. When people asked me why, I would simply say because I had done it last year. But I knew inside the real reason. I had not forgiven myself for my error from the past year. And the shame I felt from that omission prevented me from agreeing to be helpful at the next year's honors program. Now, I know in the scheme of things, this is not a major event. However, it does illustrate how easy it is to withhold forgiveness from ourselves. And you would think I would know better. No one else was blaming me, but I could not stop blaming myself. You see, the biggest barrier to self-forgiveness is your own resistance to it. And it's not just that you feel bad for what you've done, but how you wrap yourself in your own guilt like a comfortable blanket. And even though this may be destroying your life, you continue to hold on to your guilt blanket for reasons you may not fully understand. Yet, forgiving yourself, while difficult, is absolutely essential. Suicide, eating disorders, substance abuse, and depression are all linked to an overwhelming sense of guilt and the inability to forgive yourself. Do you find that you can justify forgiving others for the wrongs they did to you, yet you find no justification for forgiving yourself for the wrongs you have committed? Perhaps you believe there is a price you must pay, some form of lifelong penance for your wrongdoing. And so you hold on to your guilt and self-condemnation, even when it is clear that by doing so, it is only harming you. So why do we resist forgiving the one person who needs it the most? One reason, which you may never have considered, is pride. Oh, I can hear the protests now. What do you mean pride? I'm suffering from low self-worth, which is just the opposite of pride. But think about it for a moment. Whenever you live by a different set of rules, a higher set of standards for yourself than for others, that is a form of pride. You may ask, how can that be? Well, When you can forgive others, but not yourself, you are in effect saying that you are less capable of making a poor decision than those other people. You are somehow wiser, better prepared, and more careful than others. So you are without excuse and therefore should not forgive yourself. Those others, being less capable than you, of course, are going to make mistakes. Such logic is absurd, but it is more common than you may think. Some may even try to use their bad feelings to protect themselves from criticism or the negative consequences of their actions. Such individuals seem to say, "Look how bad I am suffering. I don't deserve any more difficulty than this." Instead of taking responsibility for what they've done by trying to make things right, they punish themselves so others will feel bad for them. But this does nothing to make the person wronged feel better, and it certainly will not help you. Unfortunately, the decision to feel miserable for the rest of your life can have tragic consequences, and not always in obvious ways. For one thing, if you keep beating yourself up, any person who tries to help you will get beat up as well. It's inevitable. Anyone who wallows in guilt is going to be more withdrawn, more critical, and less open than normal. So whoever's around, your spouse, your children, your parents, or your friends, is going to suffer right along with you. And there is another principle that comes into play here. Misery loves company. When you are miserable all the time, you will tend to surround yourself with others who are chronically miserable. Do you think hanging around with people who are down all the time is going to somehow lift you up? I doubt it. If this describes you, it is time to forgive yourself. The energy it takes to harbor hatred toward yourself is exhausting. And every bit of energy you give to your negative regrets robs you of the very energy you need to improve your life. So what can you do to start your journey towards self-forgiveness? Here are some important steps you can take right now to reduce guilt and to start the process of self-forgiveness. 1. Name the offense. Naming the offense begins the forgiveness process. It allows you to break down the overwhelming jumbled feelings into manageable parts. Ask yourself, am I feeling this way because the outcome makes me feel bad? Or am I feeling this way because I am to blame for my actions? By asking these and similar questions, you can better assess your thoughts and behavior while gaining emotional distance from the event. 2. Share your thoughts with someone you trust. Articulate the specific wrong you committed and the harm it caused. Tell a trusted friend about what you did and what you would like to do to correct it. Emotions can get the best of all of us and start to jumble all our thoughts together. Talking with someone else helps you to sort out your feelings and thoughts. It also reminds us that everyone makes mistakes. 3. Know what you want. You may not necessarily want to reconcile with the person you hurt. You may simply want to make right a wrong you have done. Be clear from the start what you hope to achieve, and you will avoid confusion both for yourself as well as for the other person. 4. Reduce unrealistic expectations. Most of us have a set of unconscious rules hovering in the back of our minds about how we expect ourselves to behave. But those rules, many of which we've absorbed in childhood, are not always realistic. Challenge your self-imposed rules and discard those that just don't make sense. 5. Identify the source of the hurt. Realize that it is the recollection and repeating of those guilty thoughts that is actually making you feel bad. It is your reaction to those past events today that is actually causing the problem. And that is not determined by what happened in the past, but by your current thought process. Will you choose to continually relive the guilt, or will you choose to forgive? Which pathway you choose will make all the difference in how you feel. 6, don't dwell on it. Falling into self-inflicted despair when you make a mistake is common. The problem is that we spend more time and energy thinking about the things we can't change than doing something about the things we can change. Replaying what you did over and over again in your head isn't going to help you or the person you hurt. It just makes you feel bad. So every time you catch yourself ruminating on your faults, stop and refocus your attention on something more useful to do with your thoughts, and then act on it. 7, say you're sorry. When you can't forgive yourself because of something you've done, sometimes all it takes is a sincere apology to make things better. Apologies are most effective if made in person. But if that's not possible, consider writing out your apology. You can decide later if you want to send the note or not. 8, make it right. Just as you would find it difficult to forgive someone until they made things right in some way, so you may need to make things right before you can forgive yourself. So how do you know when you adequately paid your dues? Receiving forgiveness from the other person is usually a good sign that your efforts are adequate. But it's ultimately up to you to decide when you've done enough to right a wrong. If you can't repay the debt, then do something helpful or be kind in some way to those you have hurt. Even if the person you hurt is dead or otherwise absent from your life, you can still make things up by providing kindness to someone else. 9, let people in. When we mess up, we often run away from friends and family. Alienating ourselves from others is a mistake, for we need to have shoulders to lean on, ears to listen, and hearts to understand. We benefit by people close to us as they help us muster the strength to put ourselves back together when we can't muster it on our own. 10, understand that your mistakes do not define you. No one has ever gone through life without messing up something. Mistakes are normal. In fact, they are a part of life. You are not perfect. You will never be perfect, so stop trying. But you can do your best. And when you come to believe that is good enough, then you will feel less guilty about your shortcomings. When I come back after the break, I will share with you a type of guilt you can experience which is not really guilt, but is in fact a form of shame and low self-worth that simply feels like guilt.
Dr. Tibbetts mentioned that part of starting on the journey of self-forgiveness was to reduce any unrealistic expectations about how we expect ourselves to behave. He also mentioned that forgiveness starts with God, and I would like to share with you the power of self-forgiveness through my own life. When I was busy working in the hospital as a medical resident, one of my after-hours duties was to carry the pager so that I could respond quickly to any medical crises that occurred on the wards. It was normal for a doctor to feel a little anxious when hearing the pager go off, and in fact, feeling that little stress take over in those instances was not a harmful effect, but rather just the right dose to help with motivation to respond quickly to medical emergencies. I started to notice in my case, however, that this anxiety was starting to intensify every time I heard the pager beeping, to the point where I began to freeze up every time the medical emergency call came through. This was not a healthy response, particularly for a doctor who needed to get to the sick patient quickly. And so I began to think about the reasons why I would respond in this way. I tried and tried, but could not pinpoint why I was so anxious. I decided to send up a word of prayer to God for help to understand the situation. I realized this was too big for me to handle on my own. A few weeks later, I sat down in a lovely restaurant to have my anniversary dinner with my husband. We were sitting at a table adjacent to a glass wall that gave a breathtaking view of the tropical gardens outside. All of a sudden, 7 small blackbirds flew straight into the glass wall and fell violently to the floor next to our table. I immediately became distressed because I could not help them. They were lying on the other side of the glass wall, away from my reach. Many had died instantly, but a few were lying on the floor and seizing. It was in this instant that an important memory of an event in my childhood came to mind. I was 8 years old and leaning on the school fence looking out onto the road during lunch break. I watched an elderly gentleman in a business suit walk on the footpath adjacent to the road. As he drew closer, he somehow tripped over his briefcase and fell on the concrete pavement. He didn't have time to put his hands out in front of him, and he hit his head with full force on the path right in front of me. He began to seize, and I knew that he was in serious trouble. However, I couldn't reach out to help him because I was so shocked that my body simply froze in place, plastered against the school fence. Thankfully, others had seen him fall and came quickly to his aid. As I recalled this event, it occurred to me that I had not been able to forgive myself since then, having been deeply ashamed of myself for not responding quickly enough to help this man in need. My lack of self-forgiveness and the belief that I was a failure for not helping the helpless led to the present struggle I had with anxiety when hearing the cardiac pager go off. The intense emotions of anxiety and fear that I felt as a child was now being relived in the present as an adult. My mind somehow associated the present medical emergencies with this past event and was causing me to respond emotionally and behaviourally in the same way as I did when I was 8 years old. It became clear to me that I had set some unrealistic rules concerning how I should have responded at such a young age. It was normal for any child or adult to freeze up in the face of traumatic events. And it was also normal for a child not to know how to respond due to their inexperience and knowledge of treating people in trauma situations. I realized through this that it was time to be kind to myself and lower the expectations I placed on myself. When I did this, I was then able to forgive myself. As a consequence, my anxiety began to subside and I was able to overcome my fear of not being able to help those in medical crises at my workplace. I challenged my self-imposed rules and discarded what didn't make sense. This reevaluation then made it easier for me to forgive myself. Self-forgiveness is critical in allowing us to move forward. It helps us develop a healthy self-respect and confidence in our personal and professional lives. I encourage you on your journey of self-forgiveness to be kind to yourself and not beat yourself up for what happened years ago in your past. Think of today as your new beginning.
Before we conclude this session, I want to reflect for a moment with you on the concept of self-forgiveness. I find it interesting that the notion of self-forgiveness is not taught by any of the world religions. In fact, the Bible never mentions self-forgiveness. The reason for this is that forgiveness comes from God. I think there is some truth to the fact that I need to be forgiven by someone outside myself before I can actually forgive myself. And thank goodness that God is always willing to forgive. So for many of you, accepting God's forgiveness may be the first step of your journey. So far, we have dealt with guilt that has some basis in fact. But for many, this is not the real problem. For lying beneath guilt is its cousin, shame. Feeling bad when you did something wrong is natural and even useful. Without it, where would you find the motivation to do better the next time? But not all bad feelings are beneficial. Shame and low self-worth are not based on what you have done wrong, but rather on what others say is wrong about you. And if you believe these messages, it can be devastating, as there is nothing you can do to actually right this ship. If left unchecked, shame and low self-worth will sink you. Shame causes you to feel inferior, inadequate, or bad about who you are, as opposed to feeling bad about something you actually did wrong. Shame isn't constructive. Instead of enhancing self-improvement, it has the opposite effect. It leads to greater self-deprivation. Feeling like you're a bad person at your core can undermine efforts to change, as change may not seem possible from this perspective. And once you suffer from shame and low self-esteem, it's common to take the blame and feel guilty not for what you did, but for something someone else does. For example, a spouse might accept her husband's blame and feel guilty for his drinking problem. She does so not because she caused her husband to drink, but because he blames her for his drinking problem. There is one thing I want you to always remember. Just because you struggle to accept yourself does not mean everyone else does. There are healthy people who can accept you as less than perfect because they accept themselves that way. Never forget, there are others who value even when you are having a hard time valuing yourself. That is why it is helpful to remember that you are not the worst person in town. While your struggles seem obvious to you, you are often much less aware of the struggles of others. The truth is, we all have hills to climb and valleys to walk through. The key is not to do it alone, or to believe you are the only one with your difficulties. You must resist the temptation to believe that your life is unforgivable. If you need to forgive yourself, then the best time to start is now. One of the clues that you have low self-esteem or have issues around shame is when you find it difficult to even identify what it is that you're feeling guilty about. However, identifying the source of your guilt is necessary in order to get past it. Alternatively, beating yourself up prolongs guilt and shame and damages your self-esteem. So take that step towards self-healing and forgive the person who needs it the most. Forgive yourself. This will be our last session together. I know I have enjoyed providing these presentations for you. I trust you have benefited by learning how forgiveness can change your life in so many different ways. You may experience some setbacks over the next several months, but don't get discouraged. You can go back over the materials in your workbook anytime and simply refresh what you have learned and hit the reset button. So in reality, this is not the end, but only the beginning of a new life for you, one that you will be living for the rest of your life. With all the benefits of forgiveness, It may be hard for you to believe that you went so many years holding onto your bitterness and resentment. You may even feel tempted to feel guilty about that. But never forget that it is better to have started the journey now than to have never started at all. So blessings on you as you continue to live the forgiving life. Turn now to section 6 in your workbook and join with your facilitator one more time as you discuss ideas and ways you can forgive yourself in order to experience a richer and fuller life.